Welcome to the Shadow of History channel. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out more videos like this one. On the 6th of July, 1942, 13-year-old Anne Frank and her family slipped into hiding inside a concealed Amsterdam warehouse annex, where she would write her now famous diary until the Gestapo's devastating arrest 2 years later. When Jaws arrived in American cinemas on the 20th of June, 1975, director Steven Spielberg could not have known that film would shatter box office records and permanently reshape Hollywood's calendar around what we now call the summer blockbuster. On the 22nd of June 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union, committing over 3 million troops to what became the single largest military operation in all of human history. As Soviet forces sealed every road into West Berlin on the 24th of June 1948, American pilot Gail Halvorson turned a simple act of handing candy to children into Operation Little Vittles, ultimately delivering more than 20 tons of sweets from the sky. Captured on the 25th of June 1848, a photograph of the June Days uprising in France quietly made history as the world's very first known act of photojournalism, documenting workers who had taken to the streets over the closure of the national workshops. On the 26th of June 1977, Elvis Presley performed for the very last time at Market Square Arena in Indianapolis, Indiana, just 51 days before his sudden death at Graceland on the 16th of August at only 42 years of age. When the United States committed its forces to the Korean War on the 27th of June 1950, it entered a conflict that would last just over 3 years, fought between a Soviet-backed North and a UN-supported South on a peninsula still divided today. On the 28th of June 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination that triggered the war, world leaders gathered in Versailles to sign the treaty that formally ended the state of war between Germany and the Allied powers of the First World War. On the 30th of June 1934, Adolf Hitler, urged forward by Goering and Himmler, ordered a wave of extrajudicial killings across Germany, a brutal political purge that history would come to know as the Night of the Long Knives. On the 1st of July 1972, approximately 2,000 people marched through the streets of London in England's first ever Gay Pride Parade, a milestone gathering that marked a defining moment in the long history of the fight for equality. After 8 years of closure following the September 11 attacks, the crown of the Statue of Liberty reopened to the public on the 4th of July 2009, welcoming visitors once again to the gift France had sent to the American people over a century before. On the 3rd of July 1886, Carl Benz officially unveiled the Benz patent Motorwagen in Germany, a purpose-built automobile that originally sold for around $150 and changed the course of human transportation forever. On the morning of the 7th of July 2005, 4 coordinated suicide bombings tore through London's transport network, killing 56 people and wounding over 700 more in the deadliest terrorist attack on British soil since Lockerbie. When the inaugural Wimbledon Championships opened on the 9th of July 1877, no one could have imagined that this first ever lawn tennis tournament would grow into the oldest and most prestigious Grand Slam in the world, still played on the same grass today. On the 18th of June 1983, Sally Ride made history aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger's STS-7 mission, becoming the first American woman ever to travel to space and opening a new chapter for women in science and exploration. For over 2,000 years, indigenous Arctic peoples, like the Inuit and Yupik, crafted narrow-slit goggles from whalebone, ivory, and driftwood to shield their eyes from blinding ultraviolet light reflecting off the snow. During World War II, the U.S. Army actively encouraged drag performances among soldiers, even publishing an official manual and shipping costume materials worldwide to help troops lift morale during one of history's most devastating conflicts. In Victorian Britain, children as young as 5 labored in dangerous coal mines for far less pay than adults, and it was photographer Lewis Hine whose powerful images helped turn the tide against child labor laws in America. Hailed as the most magnificent public library in the country, when it opened in 1874, Cincinnati's beloved library was demolished in 1955, replaced by an office building and a parking lot that stand on that ground today. Built in 1890 to support 5,000 telephone lines, Stockholm's towering telephone exchange became a symbol of the chaotic wiring that overtook cities worldwide as demand for telephone connections rapidly outpaced available technology. A Soviet helicopter passes one of Afghanistan's ancient Bamiyan Buddhas in 1980, monuments carved into sandstone cliffs in the 6th century that the Taliban would ultimately destroy completely just 21 years later in 2001. Created in 14th century France, this drawing of a lion playing violin reflects how medieval artists prioritized religious symbolism and humor over realism, since most Europeans at the time had never actually seen an exotic animal like a lion. In the early 1900s, doctors placed polio and arthritis patients in hospital beds on rooftops, believing sunlight could aid recovery, decades before a vaccine finally became widely available in 1955 and largely eradicated the disease. Photographed in Paris in 1906 at just 16 years old, Agatha Christie would go on to become the best-selling novelist in history, with over 2 billion books sold across 66 detective novels and 14 short story collections. Though he was exempt from service due to his age, Harry S. Truman voluntarily re-enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1917 and later credited his entire political career to the leadership abilities he discovered on the battlefields of World War I. Captured in a Tsarist secret police mugshot in Petersburg in 1911, the young Joseph Stalin had already masterminded a daring bank heist in 1907, stealing the equivalent of $4 million to fund Vladimir Lenin's revolutionary movement. When a young Xi Jinping visited San Francisco in 1985 as a junior Communist Party official from Hebei province, few could have imagined that this man, who had once been sent to the countryside for manual labor, would one day lead China. Discovered in a royal tomb at the ancient Maya site of Waka, these remarkable ceramic figurines from 600 AD depict the king surrounded by spirit animals and court members, offering a rare window into Maya civilization at its cultural height. On February 2, 1983, President Ronald Reagan met with Afghan Mujahideen fighters at the White House, as the United States provided weapons and support to resistance forces battling the Soviet military occupation that had begun in 1979. Excavated in 1900 after being lost for centuries beneath the Taklamakan desert sands, the ancient Silk Road outpost of Dandan Oilik once housed 14 Buddhist temples and thrived as a prosperous trade hub from the 6th century onward. Standing before Balance Rock around 1920, this couple visited a landscape the Ute people had called home for centuries before U.S. government forces removed them to reservations, opening the area to settlers and eventually the public as a park. Photographed in April 1951, these former Puerto Rican soldiers gathered around a pastry chef to learn cake decorating at a vocational school, representing just a small portion of the 61,000 Puerto Ricans who had served in the Korean War alone. Published in the Strand magazine in 1892, this photograph of 2 Victorian women building an elaborate snow lady in Mangbourne, England, appeared in a widely popular general interest publication that ran for over 60 years before finally closing in 1950. Invented by the French and adopted by both sides in World War I, these hollow iron replica trees were secretly installed overnight in no man's land, concealing armed observers who spied on enemy movements from within their metal trunks. During a 10-week stay in Venice in 1908, Impressionist pioneer Claude Monet produced 37 paintings of the city's architectural landmarks alongside his second wife, Alice, in what became one of the most celebrated chapters of his artistic career. Photographed around 1916 outside his shoe store in Portland, Oregon, Nessim Menashe was part of the first wave of Sephardic Jewish families in the region, whose ancestors had emigrated primarily from Turkey and the Isle of Rhodes. On March 29, 1955, one of 14 nuclear explosions detonated at the Nevada test site as part of Operation Teapot sent a massive fireball into the desert sky during a series of tests that defined the Cold War nuclear arms race. In January 1943, the Ronga Brothers Italian grocery store on Mulberry Street stood as a quiet testament to the 4 million Italian immigrants who had arrived in America between 1888 and 1920, many of them settling in New York's Little Italy. Captured after a tradition that dates back generations, 3 Princeton University students posed together in 1893 following a freshman-sophomore snowball fight, a ritual that still takes place today at America's 4th oldest university. Rising 20 meters against the Iranian sky, the Tower of Togrul was built in the 12th century as the final resting place of Seljuk Empire founder Togrul, whose domain once stretched from modern-day Turkey all the way to Afghanistan. Working with fine linen thread in Brittany around 1920, these 3 lace makers practiced a craft that had captivated European luxury markets since the early 1500s, long before mechanized machines largely replaced their painstaking handwork by the late 1800s. On October 2, 1918, British Brigadier General John Vaughan Campbell addressed soldiers of the 137th Brigade along the St. Quentin Canal during the 100 Days Offensive, a coordinated Allied push that would finally force Germany's collapse just weeks later in November. Shot between the eyes by a musket ball at the Battle of Chickamauga in 1863, Union soldier Jacob Miller was left for dead on the battlefield, yet crawled to safety, survived, lived to give a public interview in 1911, and died in 1917 at the age of 88. Hidden inside London's Elizabeth Tower in the 1920s, this rare glimpse reveals the inner world of Big Ben, a cathedral of iron and clockwork that had been silently measuring the city's time for decades. Crafted under Peter Carl Fabergé's supervision in 1901, this jeweled Easter egg, made from gold, enamel, rock crystal, and seed pearls, was a gift from Tsar Nicholas II to his mother, Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna, for Easter. In Stockholm in 1892, Gustav Zander unveiled one of the world's very first gym machines, a mechanical invention that quietly foreshadowed the entire modern fitness industry long before anyone had a name for it. In 1922, Viola Lalonde and Elizabeth Van Tuyl posed beside their Ford automobile in Washington, D.C., just before setting off on a bold cross-country drive all the way to San Francisco. Before the world-famous Iron Tower ever rose above Paris, workers in 1887 were already breaking ground, laying the deep foundations that would anchor what would become the most visited monument on Earth. Taking to the skies over America in 1948, the Convair Model 118 Convair car was a genuine flying automobile, a machine that briefly made the dream of a car with wings feel tantalizingly within reach. Greek Orthodox monk Mihailo Tolodos reportedly lived his entire 82 years of life within monastery walls, never once laying eyes on a woman, a fact that made him one of history's most extraordinary human stories. For the very first time, a family in Burgundy, France gathered around a glowing television screen in 1962, captured in a quiet domestic moment that photographer Janine Niepce preserved for all of history. With its iconic gull-wing doors thrown wide open in 1981, the DeLorean stands as one of the most paradoxical and visually striking automobiles ever to roll off a production line. In this 1954 illustration by Richard Sargent, The concept of anger transference is depicted in a way that captures how everyday frustrations could ripple outward through the ordinary spaces of mid-century American life. This Van Huysen advertisement, running through the 1960s and into the 1970s, stands as a striking artifact of the attitudes and advertising conventions that defined that era in American commercial culture. In 1960, Otto Frank, the sole surviving member of his family after the Holocaust, returned to the hidden attic in the secret annex where his family had sheltered from the occupiers, captured here by photographer Arnold Newman. In 1939, Farm Security Administration photographer Arthur Rothstein documented cowboys and ranch hands at the Quarter Circle U Ranch in Bighorn County, Montana, as they gathered their herds for the seasonal roundup. With no mobile phones available in the 1970s, young women lined up patiently along a dormitory corridor, waiting their turn to use a shared telephone to reach family and friends far away. Frozen in 1982, this photograph of Times Square at 44th and Broadway captures Beefsteak Charlie's restaurant and the Discomat store standing side by side in a New York City that feels both familiar and long gone. Photographed around 1908 by Roland W. Reed, this portrait of an Ojibwe woman in Ponema, Minnesota offers a quietly dignified window into indigenous life in the Great Lakes region at the turn of the 20th century. Captured between 1901 and 1902, this photograph, simply labeled Keith's Bicycle Track, documents an early cycling facility at a moment when bicycles were still transforming how ordinary people move through their world. Ruth Malcolmson of Philadelphia was crowned Miss America in 1924, becoming a symbol of beauty and public attention at a time when the pageant was still finding its identity in a rapidly changing America. Beginning in the 1930s, Rye Crisp, a rye crisp bread brand, heavily marketed its product as a weight loss aid in magazines aimed at women and young girls, as this 1940s advertisement starkly illustrates. In a 1936 issue of Life magazine, Japan's Emperor Hirohito is photographed inspecting the Type 90 large air sound detector, a massive acoustic device the press nicknamed the War Tuba. In 1974, French high-wire artist Philippe Petit walked across a tightrope strung between the twin towers of the World Trade Center, performing one of the most daring and unauthorized acts of aerial artistry in history. These elegantly crafted silk and leather men's shoes, made in France between 1690 and 1700, offer a rare and intimate look at the refined fashion standards of late 17th century European aristocracy. Workers pause proudly beside the massive anchor chains of the RMS Mauritania in the early 1900s, offering a human sense of scale beside the enormous ironwork of one of the era's great ocean liners. A particularly colorful Tupperware party in the 1950s captures the domestic enthusiasm surrounding Earl Silas Tupper's 1942 invention, a refined polyethylene product he boldly called Poly-T, material of the future. In 1957, Marilyn Monroe browsed a men's clothing store on Fifth Avenue in New York City, while onlookers peered through the shop windows, captured in this candid street moment by photographer Sam Shaw. A December 1951 advertisement for the IBM 604 electronic calculating punch, first produced in 1948, boldly claimed the machine could perform the work of 150 engineers armed with slide rules. Annie Edson Taylor posed proudly in 1901 beside the barrel she had just ridden over Niagara Falls, becoming one of the most audacious daredevils of her time in a single thundering plunge. Washed ashore on the beach at Hastings, England in 1919, the German World War I submarine U-118 became an unlikely landmark, drawing curious visitors to its rusting hull for years after the war ended. 3 young women stretched out on inflatable mattresses at the island of Capri in 1939, eating spaghetti in a sun-drenched moment that captures the ease of that last summer before the Second World War. A family gathered around their television set in 1991 to watch Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev deliver his resignation speech, a moment that marked the end of the Soviet Union and of a world order. Before funding was exhausted in 1941, the original design for Mount Rushmore envisioned the four presidents depicted far more fully than what stands today, with the unfinished vision frozen in the Black Hills forever. In 1959, photographer Orman Gigley captured the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in an image that frames one of the most powerful financial institutions on Earth, with the quiet authority of its imposing stone exterior. During Prohibition, a federal agent in Los Angeles in 1926 inspected a lumber truck after detecting the scent of alcohol, a moment that reveals how ingeniously bootleggers disguised their contraband to evade the law. At Fort Bragg in 1961, a soldier demonstrated a rocket belt, the jetpack technology that briefly made personal flight seem like it was only a generation away from becoming a reality. Rain fell over the Ginza district of Tokyo in 1969, catching pedestrians mid-stride in a wet and luminous street scene that captures the rhythm of one of Asia's most dynamic cities in a single unguarded moment. French painter Joseph Ducrot broke every convention of formal portraiture in the 1700s with a series of wildly expressive self-portraits, irreverent, theatrical, and utterly unlike anything his contemporaries were producing. In 1964, 21-year-old Bobby Fischer sat down to play 50 opponents simultaneously, winning 47 games, drawing 2, and losing only 1 in a performance that cemented his reputation as a chess phenomenon. Among the many unwritten customs aboard Navy destroyer USS Kidd, which sailed from 1943 to 1967, one toilet seat was painted red and reserved exclusively for crew members suffering from sexually transmitted diseases. In Washington in 1905, a team of horses hauled a spruce log measuring 30 feet in circumference, a powerful image of the raw scale of the Pacific Northwest timber industry at the height of the logging era. Described as biological robots, the Chernobyl liquidators had only seconds per shift to shovel radioactive debris from the roof of the NO. 4-reactor, brief, dangerous passes that exposed them to potentially lethal doses of radiation. Built in Rome in the 1970s, the Corviale stretches a full kilometer in length, housing around 8,000 people in a single building, designed to function as a self-sufficient world of stores, clinics, and services. Photographed by Lewis in Pennsylvania in 1911, these children laboring in coal mines became powerful evidence in the fight for child labor reform, images that helped change the laws of the United States. Chief Engineer Joseph Strauss ordered a safety net installed beneath the Golden Gate Bridge during its construction, a revolutionary decision for the era that ultimately saved the lives of 19 men who fell into it. On September 11, 2001, with Lower Manhattan in chaos, New York Police Department officers moved their temporary headquarters into a nearby Burger King, improvising order in the shadow of unimaginable destruction. On August 22, 1969, at John Lennon's countryside estate, the 4 Beatles were photographed together for the very last time, an unremarkable afternoon that neither they nor the world would recognize until much later. Conducted around 1933, the tilt test placed a London double-decker bus at a steep angle to prove beyond any doubt that the iconic vehicles were stable and posed no tipping hazard to the riding public. This 1925 photograph from Amsterdam shows a child riding in a small front-mounted seat on a bicycle, an early glimpse of a practical cycling culture that the Netherlands would make famous across the entire world. 3 friends rode their open vehicle through Ohio around 1924, captured in the carefree spirit of a decade, when the automobile was still new enough to feel like an adventure every time you climbed in. Rare photographs from 1900 to 1918 document the final years of 4 centuries of Ottoman rule over Jerusalem, a city whose inhabitants and rulers had changed countless times across the long sweep of recorded history. This German hair perming apparatus from the 1920s, a tangle of heated rods and wires clamped around a woman's head, stands as one of the more startling testaments to the lengths people went for fashionable hair. Dressed for the Arctic in 1909, Robert Peary set out for the frozen north in full expedition gear, preparing for the brutal conditions of one of the most celebrated polar exploration attempts in American history. Photographed in Texas in 1910, this aging cowboy represents one of the last survivors of the American Old West, a fading way of life that the 20th century would soon replace entirely with something unrecognizable. In 1957, a Victorian-era house in Tiburon, California was loaded onto a boat and transported across the water, a remarkable feat of preservation that kept an entire piece of 19th century architecture intact and afloat. In the summer of 1969, an aerial photograph captured more than 400,000 people gathered at Woodstock, a single image that became one of the defining portraits of a generation and its ideals. In 1903, a steam-powered lawnmower trimmed the grounds of the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C., taking over a job that had previously been performed, quite practically, by a flock of grazing sheep. The Messerschmitt KR200 bubble car became one of the most distinctive symbols of 1950s motoring, a compact, streamlined vehicle so unusual in shape that it turned every camping trip into a conversation piece. Photographed in the 1920s by Max van Oppenheim, an ancient Roman bridge spanning the Wadi al-Mur near Mosul, Iraq, stands as quiet evidence of how far Rome's builders extended their engineering reach into the ancient world. Produced between 1919 and 1925, the French Layat Helica was a propeller-driven automobile so unconventional in design that it looked less like a car and more like a small aircraft that had lost its wings. In 1957, photographer Esther Bubley captured a private moment of a person absorbed in listening to records, a quiet image of music as it was experienced before the world could carry a playlist in its pocket. In 1985, a construction worker prepared for the careful removal of the original Statue of Liberty torch, which would go on a national tour across the United States before finding its permanent home in the Statue of Liberty Museum. Photographed by Ralph Crane in 1958, Vicki Dugan, known by the nickname The Back, posed for a portrait that made her one of the most distinctively branded personalities of late 1950s American celebrity culture. In August 1952, passengers aboard a train traveling between Tokyo and Osaka stepped onto the platform at Hamamatsu for a 5-minute stop and followed a drill master through 3 minutes of organized calisthenics. In Seattle in 1973, an electric AMC Gremlin pulled up to a curbside charging station where drivers could replenish their battery for just 25 cents per hour, a glimpse of an electric future that arrived 50 years early. On December 29, 1965, icebreakers worked together in Antarctica to push a large iceberg clear of a passage in McMurdo Sound, combining industrial force with the frozen geography of the world's most remote continent. This 1936 photograph from Lexington, Tennessee shows a family standing outside their rural home in quiet dignity, one of countless images that documented the everyday texture of American life during the Great Depression. In the Soviet Union, citizens who wanted a Moskvich, Zaporozhets, Volga, or Pobeda, the most popular cars of the state, had no choice but to join a waiting queue that could last several years before their name was called. A 1979 advertisement for London's transit system used a pointed visual argument to show how the city would look if it had been designed by American urban planners, a sharp and good-humored piece of civic pride. Introduced to the world in 1981, The Osborne was the first laptop computer ever produced, a bulky but groundbreaking machine that proved for the first time that a computer could be carried from place to place. In 1913, workers broke through rock and earth at the Panama Canal excavation site, pressing forward on one of the most ambitious engineering projects ever undertaken, a dig that would eventually connect two oceans.